Hello students, today's video lecture is on how skeletal muscles work. Let's get started. So the title of this page is Superficial Skeletal Muscles. That's what we'll be learning in the coming weeks. So remember, superficial means close to the surface. We're also going to be learning a little bit about what they do and how they move our body, which is why we've studied the movements. But before we do any of that, we need to learn how a muscle works on a larger scale. We're not going to get into the microscopic details. We're just going to look at how a muscle is able to move bones. So there's some information that you have to understand in order to start. So let's get to it. Skeletal muscles are attached usually to bones in at least two places, and they will stretch over or across a joint in order to create movement. Let's take a look at the anatomy atlas. So here the atlas is demonstrating the action called elbow flexion and then elbow extension. This particular animation is trying to illustrate what muscles accomplish flexion at the elbow. But I wanted to show you specifically, if we get really close to the elbow, how these muscles here and here and even here, if we turn, are across the elbow joint, which is right here. See how the muscle starts in one spot and goes all the way across the joint and then lands on the other side of the joint, kind of like a bridge over top of the joint? That's important. So we can see that muscles are attached in at least two places. This one is attached down here on the distal end of the radius, and then up here on the humerus. This one is attached to the radius again, and over here to the scapula. This is actually part of the same muscle. This one has two attachments on the upper end and one on the lower end. And then this one attaches to the ulna and the humerus. Okay, so we saw that they're attached in at least two places and they stretch over a joint in order to create movement. Number two, skeletal muscles will create an action at the joint that they cross. And I'm going to make that with a possibility of plural, because sometimes skeletal muscles will cross more than one joint and they will affect both. Again, in the atlas, we can see that these muscles cross the elbow, so they're going to have an action at the elbow. Now, if we take a look at the wrist, for example, the wrist joint is here. None of these muscles cross over the wrist. In order to do so, they would have to stretch all the way across and attach somewhere down here. None of them do that, so they don't have any action at the wrist. They all have action at the elbow because that's the joint that they're spanning over, like a bridge from one side of the joint all the way to the other side. Rule number three, skeletal muscles contract in the direction of their muscle cells, which we can actually visualize. I call this the muscle's grain, almost like the grain on wood. So let's take a look again. We'll get really close. You notice how in this muscle we can actually see sort of like lines running this direction. That's the grain. That's my terminology of the muscle. Let's take a look at a different example that's not on the arm. This one specifically, this big muscle on the side of your head, the side of your skull. Notice the grain. You can see the little lines inside of it. The muscle will have to contract along this direction. Okay, so when a muscle contracts, and we'll get to this in a second, it shortens. So it can only shorten in one direction. So it's either going to shorten up or it's going to shorten down, and we have to see which one is more reasonable. Let's look at one more example. I'm going to turn this so we can see it a little better. This huge muscle of the chest, if we get closer, we can see it has a really interesting grain. This part goes up to the clavicle, this part goes to the sternum, and this section goes to the ribs, or the costal cartilage of the ribs. So it almost like fans out at the center part of the chest. But notice it all lands on the humerus over here. So you can actually see the grain of the muscle, and it's going to have to contract along the length of that grain. All right, rule number 4, muscles shorten in length along the grain when they contract, and that's what I was just illustrating. So this muscle, for example, of the chest will have to shorten along this length. So this will be moved closer to this, or this will be moved closer to this. We have to figure out what's more reasonable. The bony attachment site of the muscle that acts as an anchor and does not move during contraction is called the origin. This seems trickier than it is with the wording. So let's go back to the arm, for example, and there's a picture down at the bottom of your notes page. But let's go back to our elbow, and let's watch as this repeatedly flexes and extends the elbow. And I want to specifically kind of talk about this muscle here called the biceps brachii. See how it's attached? If we look carefully, it's attaching to the scapula and down on the other end to, well, it's hard to see, but it's the radius specifically. This one might be easier to see how it attaches to the radius into the scapula. So we have an attachment site here, and we have an attachment site here. Only one of those actually moves a bone. Let's watch again. Which side is the moving side? The scapula is absolutely not moving. The radius is. So in the notes I'm saying which side is anchored, this side, that side is called the origin. The actual attachment point on the scapula where this muscle attaches is known as the origin of the muscle. The bony attachment site of the muscle that acts as an anchor and doesn't move a bone during contraction is the origin of that muscle. So origin equals anchor. Now, the other end of the muscle does move a bone, and that end is called the insertion. So we can see in this case, it's the lower end that actually pulls a bone. So that's number 6. The bony attachment site of a muscle that is moved when the muscle contracts is called the insertion of that muscle. So insertion is the moving end. Rule number 7. During contraction, remember the muscle shortens in length. The insertion, the moving end, is pulled towards the origin, the anchor. Let's watch it in action. So our animation is showing us flexion at the elbow. This is the origin end up here. This is the insertion end down here. And when we do elbow flexion, when we raise that lower arm up, this side of the muscle actually is pulled, shortens in length towards this side. Muscles only shorten in one direction. So when I push play again, it's going to go back to its neutral position, which is like anatomical position. But watch as that lower end of this muscle shortens this direction to make the movement happen. Okay, back to the beginning. Pulls it up. Pulls it up. So number 7, during contraction, the insertion of the muscle is moved towards the origin of the muscle. I'm going to write that idea the same way every time. The insertion is moved closer to the origin, and I always say I to O. This arrow represents the direction of the motion. So let's go back to our atlas. I'm going to pause this and turn it. Remember, this was the origin end up here, specifically right there. This is the insertion end, and the muscle pulls like this. So if I take that off to the side, it follows my little terminology that I'm using in the notes. I moves closer to O. Last rule. Based on the previous information, this means that muscles always pull two bones closer together. They're never able to push them apart. Okay, so back to our atlas. This animation is kind of on a loop, and you can see that here. So when we pull forward, this is flexion, and this animation is going to reset itself. It doesn't mean that this muscle also does extension, because watch the muscle width. It gets wider and the whole length shortens as we go through this animation. See it widening, 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 and then the animation resets itself. So let's figure out if this muscle does elbow flexion, what muscle does elbow extension? Look, it's on the opposite side. So watch. We start out in a flex position, and this muscle shortens. Watch it shortening. See, it's shortening in the same direction, but it's on the back of the arm. Shortens. Whoops, let's start at the beginning. Shortens to pull the arm straight again. So that's extension. So what I'm telling you is the muscle on this side did flexion. The muscle on this side does extension because it pulls that lower arm back into its original position. Every muscle in the body works the same way. So let's put some information on our diagram down here. This is the muscle, and we call it a skeletal muscle because it's attached to our skeleton. This one's specifically called the biceps brachii, which we'll learn in another lesson. That skeletal muscle is attached to bones in at least 2 different places. This one actually has 3 attachment sites. So this gray thing here is a tendon. This gray thing is a separate tendon. And then this gray thing at the bottom is a third tendon. It has to have at least 2, one on one side and one on the other. This is common where it's anchored in 2 places. Okay, then we also learned that the non-moving or anchor side of the muscle is called the origin. So this up here does not move when our muscle contracts, nor does this. There's no pulling up here. That's the origin ends. They're anchored and no movement of the scapula happens. Okay, this muscle doesn't pull our scapula in any way. We just use it as an anchor point. And then the bottom end is called the insertion. I'm putting an I. So the insertion end is pulled towards the origin. We would need a completely separate muscle to do the opposite of this muscle. So this muscle does elbow flexion. Remember, the muscles that do extension were back here in the back of the arm. They work the same way, except instead of pulling the lower arm this way, they pull it back to its neutral position.